What does it mean to be British today? In the 70 years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, both this nation and its identity have changed dramatically, along with its place in the world. When the Queen took the throne in 1952, Britain was still an empire and mostly still an industrial nation. Most people didn't have inside toilets, let alone a fridge or a telephone. A woman's place was mostly in the home, and gay people were openly persecuted by the state. Today, despite huge advances in social attitudes, we are no longer the global superpower we once were. And long gone are the days where Britannia ruled the waves. Our economy, quite frankly, is on its knees. Last month, we saw the UK slip behind India as it fell to 6th place among the world's largest economies. The pound is crumbling, and the OECD warned UK growth will be the worst in the G20, second only to war-sanctioned Russia. We've put up barriers to trade with our largest trading partner, who we now find ourselves on the brink of a trade war with, while any hope of a trade deal with the US, as we've just found out this week, is years away at best. Add to that the death of Queen Elizabeth, and are we seeing the death of Britain's soft power too? The Queen was universally admired, but given what we know of the King's transgressions, both personal and public, will he be? 12 nations are already taking this as a moment for national introspection and considering a breakaway from the British monarch as head of state. So where exactly does this leave Britain? Is it time we leave behind the British identity we formed under Empire and embrace a new, modern idea of what Britain is? And what exactly would that look like? Well, that's what we're here to discuss tonight at The Table, a new discussion show from Byline TV. At this table, we're going to be having productive conversations about issues that matter with people we might not always agree with. But this isn't just any other talk show. At this table, there's no hiding behind soundbites or slogans. We are digging deeper to explore the philosophical and cultural underpinnings behind the debate and examining our own positions too. Joining me at the table tonight are Polly Toynbee, Guardian columnist and author, Mike Galsworthy, founder of Scientists for EU, Hardy Matharu, editor of Byline Times, and Elliot Wilson, columnist for The Telegraph and City AM. So thank you all for being here, because not everyone does say yes. In fact, we had a Conservative politician refuse to join us to debate this very issue. Why? Well, because I tweeted this. Have a look. The BBC tweeted, "How can I watch Queen Elizabeth's funeral?" To which I responded, "Is there another article coming regarding how you can not watch it for balance?" And this was deemed too disrespectful given the timing, and therefore said politician refused to come on the show. But actually is now exactly the right time to be having these conversations about the existence of monarchy in Britain. Should we start with you, Polly?
The monarchy. Well, I think it's time we got rid of the monarchy. I've thought it for a long time. Are we close to that? I'd rather doubt it. Because although the popularity of the monarchy is retreating and young people, amongst the young, a majority are for getting rid of it, I still think it would take a huge upheaval. But part of the reason for getting rid of it is to have a rethink of our entire constitution. It's not just about whether or not you like the idea or whether they cost too much or what characters they are. We have an appalling constitution that's in a very bad way. And I think that the service that Boris Johnson did us was to show how fragile our constitution is, that there are no checks and balances. There is nothing to stop a Prime Minister going rogue if he wants to. The Speaker of the House has no power. And the point about the monarchy, the most important point about the monarchy, is it has no power. It's not that it's too powerful or uses its small powers occasionally for its own self-interest. If we had an elected president, the president would be the protector of the Constitution and would be able to step in when Boris Johnson illegally prorogued Parliament and say, no, you can't. The poor Queen had to obey what the Prime Minister said. So when the Prime Minister said, I'm proroguing Parliament, she had to ask his advice as to whether that was the right thing to do, which is absurd. And you look at presidents around Europe, they are dignified. They are quite separate to the political process, even if they're ex-politicians. Look at the ones in Ireland, have been splendid. They stay out of the way, except for ceremonial purposes, but they are there as that safeguard. And I think we now know how important that is.
Agreed. I mean, I'm very much aligned with your views. I sometimes wonder if we're ready for a republic, just given the state of where we are and how we would elect that person. But before we move on to that, Elliot, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I didn't agree with any of that, really. I mean, the monarchy is in existence, and, you know, no matter how we look at it, how we cut it, how you look at the polls, there is a consistent level of support for retaining the monarchy. There has never been any indication that there's anything like a majority.
Not with the younger. So as Polly touched upon, 18 to 24-year-olds are 31% in favour of keeping monarchy versus 41% who want to get rid.
And old people get to vote too. That's the thing. Overall, the population has been consistently in favour of retaining the monarchy as long as we can remember. So, you know, that can almost be put to bed. When there is if there is a majority, which I doubt anytime soon, for getting rid of the monarchy, it'll be gone. That's not a problem. But there isn't anything like that majority. But I think Polly's issue about the Constitution is a slightly odd one, because she's saying that there was no checks and balances, Boris was allowed to do what he wanted. Well, the Supreme Court said that prorogation was illegal, and therefore it was reversed or actually deemed not to have happened. So that was a check and balance. Boris was, found guilty of having had an illegal party. He's ended up out of Downing Street. Actually, if you look at what's happened over the past 3 years, Boris Johnson has consistently pushed the Constitution to its limits, but they've always held. They've been stretched a long way, but they haven't actually been broken. And I think actually that's a testament to the resilience of the Constitution we have.
Yeah, I would possibly have to disagree there. I think you've named two instances where there have eventually been some sort of repercussions, but there have been so many where there's been a subverting or an undermining of democracy where actually nothing has happened. We're seeing rampant cronyism in terms of who's being recruited into government. We're seeing bodies that are supposed to be regulatory, such as the Electoral Commission, losing their teeth, coming, in some part under government power. And a myriad of other things, for example, the funding of his flat, etc., which are a huge breach in terms of the ministerial code, lying to Parliament, and there have been no such repercussions.
Well, I mean, funding somebody's flat isn't a constitutional issue, but I mean, there are checks and balances in place. You know, the Prime Minister is ultimately responsible to the House of Commons. He can be sacked, or she can be sacked now, tomorrow, if the House wanted to. It could withdraw its support, that would be it. It is said we have an unwritten constitution. That's not actually true. What we have is an uncodified constitution. There are several documents we can look at to look at essentially a sort of how to run its manual of the UK. And actually that has, with considerable pressure, withstood. It has held. I mean, the Supreme Court has done its job. I disagree with some of its judgments, but it's in place and it's done its job. Boris has resigned. There is an issue around ministerial standards and advice on that, and that's certainly something that needs to be looked at. But again, that's not a constitutional issue. That's not something that would necessarily be prevented by a piece of paper with, the how-to manual for the UK written on it.
I mean, you could argue the case in the US, obviously, they do have a written constitution, and it's not exactly working out particularly well for them there.
I think in terms of your original question, Marina, about is it time to be questioning the system that we have and what monarchy means, I think absolutely it is the time. In many ways, the Queen was that bridge between Imperial Britain and the modern UK, and I think it's a perfect opportunity, her death, to be looking at what really sits behind that, what myths, what notions that we have had about ourselves as a country are still playing out today, perhaps in policies such as Brexit and global Britain and a retreat from the global stage today. What are the consequences of that? And I think as a confident, more self-aware nation can accept if people don't want to watch the Queen's funeral, or they don't want necessarily the monarchy anymore, or they want to debate what constitutional checks and balances exist or not. If we're not always just thinking that our best days are behind us, that the Second World War and Churchill and the Blitz spirit is the best of us, that there are good days ahead that we can look forward with a vision, then I think you wouldn't be threatened by somebody who doesn't want to watch the Queen's funeral or somebody who wants to discuss the monarchy. So I think it is about British identity. And I think it's been fantastic because we have started to see these conversations happen. I would like the new king to acknowledge that the country he is taken over in a way. It's very different.
How would you expect him to do that? It's a very tricky position
Well,
he puts himself in.
that's the trickiness, isn't it? I mean, we know because he's had so long being the heir to the throne that he does care about the climate emergency. He has raised issues around racism in this country. There are things that he has cared about for many years. What I would like to see is for him to, as a monarch, as much as he feels he can, start to raise the conversation about those issues. The problem is, though, he sits at the top of an institution which, for some people, is very much about the mythology of Britain and that half story, as I call it, of Britain, the imperial Britain all the way up to today.
Isn't some of the fondness for our monarchy the fact that it is supposed to be apolitical? That it's, never explain, never complain, or whatever it is. So actually, are we going to see that from Prince Charles? Is he going to be speaking out against climate change? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Mike?
I think he won't. I think we're probably more likely to see that taken up by his son, who now steps into his position and has already made speeches along those lines. I absolutely think that now is a good time to discuss where our country's at. The past is long, but the future is longer, unless Putin gets his way and goes into a panic and hits some buttons. But when you view your country over the long scale of things, you always should be asking the questions of, are we fit for the future? Are we ticking all the boxes that satisfy not just our economic needs, but our soul as a nation in terms of being who we want to be? And so for me, I'd like to separate out the royal family pageantry and functions that it has in that sense from the constitutional issues that Polly was highlighting. For me, I want to keep the royal family. I like the royal family because when we look back at who have been here on these isles down the centuries and the castles and churches and palaces that we've built, and we've got that connection from the past through a royal family that makes sure that those buildings are not dead. They live and breathe with the spirit of tradition, which isn't just empty ceremony once in a while. It continues through. And also associated with all that pageantry and colour and breathing life from the past through to now, we have the involvement of the royal family in charities right across this country, and also their diplomatic outreach, which is not on that political level of, say, a president whose opinions might be known, but I think it adds something extra. However, there are constitutional issues which we absolutely need to deal with. There's aspects also of the royal family, like, for example, Charles coming to the throne, paying no inheritance tax, which is outright wrong. The welfareism around the monarchy as well, for certain privileged individuals, that's clearly wrong. And I don't think the monarchy is sustainable if we've got children cold and starving and suffering while people around the monarchy are being treated well. It's not going to maintain itself properly unless we're also doing that fundamental of taking care of our society, making sure that there is that sense of fairness. All politics is based on this sense of fairness. You start losing that and things start falling apart. And on the constitutional issues, just finally, the simple notion that if you either tell a lie or just misspeak in Parliament, you come back and correct the record. That should be a fundamental. We have not seen that happen on many, many, many occasions under Boris Johnson, almost quite uniquely under Boris Johnson, and it has not been within the power of the Speaker nor anyone else in this country to make that happen. And so aspects like that, I think, do need to be looked at again. So I think we need to look at things in the round, definitely have a conversation about the monarchy and republicanism at any time, because why not? You should always be having these open conversations. But in terms of the actual constitutional structure by which we function, Boris Johnson has indeed shed light on real frailties in parts of it, real breakdown in trust in parts of it, and I think that conversation is actually more urgent than the monarchy one.
I think, in fairness, to talk about the issue of lying in Parliament, which is a very serious issue and traditionally has been, calls for ministerial resignations. Boris Johnson is still under investigation by the Committee of Privileges, which may find that he has misled Parliament. And interestingly, the committee has been given a remit to find whether he's misled Parliament knowingly or not. They've taken away the idea of intent. So they're looking at whether he misled Parliament, and if they find that he did, then there are possible sanctions.
Of course, they may not be allowed to continue with it, because Liz Truss has said if a Tory MP brought up an objection and put through a bill saying we wouldn't do it, she would vote against the Committee of Privileges. And that's shocking that, it's elective dictatorship, a crude majority can sweep away those protections. And that's why we need more protection than just the goodwill of a majority of the House of Commons.
I found just one point of yours, Mike, was really interesting about you think the inequality in society on a political level is wrong and something needs to be done about that. And it's really interesting, isn't it, the extent to which, even in a symbolic sense, having a hereditary monarchy that sits at the top of that system, do you think that perpetuates a sense of inequality in the idea that Britain has of itself? Of course, it's not the monarchy, deciding on policies of a lack of redistribution or, increasing inequality, but surely we have an aristocratic elite that sits at the top of the system. Does that breed a sense of inequality?
So
that matters.
I mean, I think, for example, in World War II, when the royal family were going around sites bombed in the Blitz and the charities that they get involved in, the more the monarchy actually gets involved in society at all levels and helping out at all levels and touching with people at all levels, the more the monarchy can actually be woven into the fabric of the nation.
Yeah, hang on, let's look
when
at
they
charity
sit
and Prince
aloof.
Charles. What about these Fortnum and Mason carrier bags full of £1 million from shady Middle Eastern characters?
Money from Osama bin Laden's
Cash.
family as well.
What on earth was that about?
Is
Now,
shocking.
his
And
charity has
also-
led him into bad trouble.
Yes, and so that is clearly a perversion of charity. And there's also, on top of that, the whole, what was his name, the chair or deputy chair of the Conservative Party, that Ben character that was setting up meetings.
Ben Elliot.
There we go, that was setting up meetings with Prince Charles in order for titles, wasn't it, or something along those lines. So those are the kind of things, because I'm not absolutist and binary in my heart, those are the kind of things that make me think, bring in the revolution, because if they're in those privileged positions, especially during tough times, and behave like that. So the inheritance tax is one thing, the relationship with the Saudis is another, the royal family getting involved in political privileges is certainly another. If there is more of that, then my heart swings very strongly to the Republican thing. So, that's my warning signals there.
That's an interesting point you bring up about Saudi Arabia, because, like it or not, and there are arguments on both sides, Saudi Arabia is a key strategic partner for the UK in the Gulf. I mean, that is true. We sell them a lot of arms, we get a lot of money out of them, and, that can be good or bad. But if the UK government is committed to a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, and it's extremely close, what should the monarchy do in terms of engaging with the Saudi monarchy? I mean, does it take a different...
It was a cash for honours type scandal. So irrespective of our relationship, surely that is just wrong. That is plainly wrong.
There is legislation against that. I mean, there's legislation from the 1920s saying you can't sell honours. So you can prosecute under that. Tony Blair was considered for prosecution under that, but no case was brought. So again, the legislation is there.
As well, in his plans to pack the Lords with, I think it's 39 Conservative peers, which will help sway legislation going forward. But again, checks and balances.
To answer your question, in terms of the diplomatic function that supports government, fine, but it is in terms of those relationships whereby you are trading favours in a way that's looked upon a lot more
wrong,
than
problem.
See, for me, and you've touched on this, the royal family, I've never understood the need for it. I've not understood the purpose it brings to people's life. For me, it is this country. I think we are very deferential. We're like a know your place, and for me, the royal family is an institution which perpetuates, classism and elitism and division. And so for me, especially when we see things like, we say that the monarchy is powerless, but actually there were times when we have seen the Queen's lawyers step in and change legislation to personally benefit her or the Crown's estate, like, for example, to hide wealth.
That's relatively small. I mean, it is annoying that she's done that, whenever it's going to interfere with her property or her interests. But hold on to the really important thing, which is about the Constitution. It's about the insanity of the House of Lords. I mean, since the beginning of the last century, we have tried to get rid of it. And a sort of bad combination of people who argue over what kind of thing should replace it and people who want to hold on to it. We've ended up with these insane hereditary peers. There is elections going on now for something like 4 or 5 of the hereditary peers. 92 people choose which of the next hereditary peers. I mean, this has to stop, but it is so linked with monarchy. And if we get rid of the monarchy, or indeed get rid of the House of Lords, it does upend a whole lot of things in our Constitution that, as you say, are about sovereign powers. The royal prerogative is a very dictatorial power that has been handed direct from the monarch to the Prime Minister, much too great and unchecked a power. And that's just because it was handed over as a package. So I don't think it's really the power of the monarchy, it's the symbolism, as you say, that makes us all not citizens, but subjects, and our idea of reverence for birth.
And in an unquestioning nature as well. I mean, it was interesting in the run-up to the Queen's funeral that we saw a few people. It wasn't thousands. It was a few people who were being moved on by police for holding up blank signs or signs saying "Not my king." And for me, it really brought home how we take for granted the unquestioning nature of living in a constitutional monarchy. We don't vote for it, and therefore protesting against it is an interesting concept, right? We're asked to just go along with it. And moments like this make us think about what we're going along with. And, for me, it's not a controversial thing to sit here talking about the monarchy and questioning it. And it comes back to this point that if you feel confident about who you are in terms of your identity, you're open to challenge, you're open to critiques. And I think too much what I see in terms of Britain and the sort of public discourse at the moment is not just defensiveness, but a lack of that critical self-reflection at a time when we need it more than ever. I mean, you started the show by talking about all these factors, practical things that are going, badly for Britain in terms of its outcomes, in terms of its wealth. We've had Brexit, and that's had consequences. So at the very moment we need to be looking in the mirror more, I think we're doing the very opposite. And my worry is with the monarchy, and the pageantry around it, as you say, Mike, is that we've seamlessly gone from one monarch to the next, and we don't, it's unquestioning.
It's been a very smooth operation, and I would concur with you.
Point.
And I would absolutely concur with you on that we've just moved from one into the other, and let us not speak about it, and let's rest people holding signs.
Now's not the time, it's not appropriate.
So, quite. So I am on your side with that one about the discussion. And I think the BBC has also been, because it's been so reverent all the way through, the famous BBC balance about big issues to discuss, they've completely locked in a box and sunk to the bottom of the Mariana Trench there on that one. And I think that you should see some of that start to come back and hopefully have more discussions like this. For me, with the royal family, it's not a case of reverence. I'm very irreverent in general about humans in general. We're all walking around on this planet for a fixed amount of time with a very limited brain in which we're trying to comprehend much more than we can. So we should see our own place there. Or as Carl Sagan says, we are an mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, and all the kings and queens and emperors that have gone before us have all fought for one little corner of that moat against other people that we have also largely forgotten. So, but for me, I've seen more the royal family as servants of the country, bringing that pageantry, bringing that sort of extra level of weave into the country and extra diplomacy abroad. For me, it's not a reverent thing. Even though I think, you know, the Queen herself was exceptional in her character and how she carried out her functions, certainly the rest of the family has not been to that degree. Well, many of them have not been anything like to that degree. As to the House of Lords, I'm all for absolutely overhauling it. I've lost my patience on that one. I completely have. I would boot them all out tomorrow, apart from the cross-party peers that I think can adequately amongst themselves carry out some of the basic
Don't you believe
functions.
they're cross-party? They're mostly Tories. Mostly.
There are some good
The
eggs in there.
crossbench is right, Tony.
Crossbenchers, not necessarily. I mean, there's a very high preponderance of their tendency to vote with the government. I mean, of course, lots of them are very independent-minded.
a Tory? I mean,
No, not all of them, but there, you know, the tendency is, and because people prefer to be non-political, or they've got jobs as chairs of charities that oblige them to be non-political.
Well, again,
Nobody is non-political.
I'm
not a single
open-minded
person.
to that entirely, Polly. All I'm saying is I would clear the lot out tomorrow. The only thing that I'm concerned about is the transition of function, because you often do get very good quality reports coming out of the House of Lords that look at lots of different aspects, and also it is a revision chamber, and it does have a lot of experienced people in there as well. So I want to get from A to B, where you've effectively booted out the whole lot of them. And for me, the only question is, how do you get the continuity of function in order for that to happen?
And this transition question, I think, is an area for concern. So whether it's ditching the House of Lords and then what comes next, or if we were to ditch the monarchy, which sounds wonderful, and become a republic, to me, sounds wonderful. But then actually, I am deeply concerned about, are we ready for a presidential system now? And I don't think we are, because I think without things such as proportional representation, without an overhaul of things like party financing, some sort of bringing the electoral, bodies like the electoral reform, well, making them independent again, but giving them the teeth to actually do something when there are breaches of electoral law. I think until we take all of those steps, I would be petrified, actually, if we did move quite quickly to a presidential system, because I think we're very vulnerable to bad actors and also a press that can put things out there. We call newspapers. Some of the headlines that we've seen, are just straight lies, and this stuff is fed to people, and they elect based on those lies. So until all of those things have been done, I worry about moving to a republic.
We don't have a strong enough framework in order to enact any substantial transitions.
Exactly.
Well, lots of people say that, and they say, we'd probably elect somebody ridiculous. But you look at the Irish, for instance, who've elected extremely sensible, they're previous politicians, whether it's Mary Robinson or currently Mike the Higgins. Sensible people who are former politicians who understand the nature and dignity of a ceremonial role. And all around Europe, you've had presidents behaving as long as that's the constitutional position, quite unlike the American situation. And I cannot believe that we are dafter than all these other countries and would elect somebody less dignified or less taken seriously. But you might be right, the Daily Mail rule will roost and then we're all done for.
That's what I used to think when we all laughed at Berlusconi, but then we got Boris Johnson, didn't we?
And then Truss. So moving on, actually.
not in the same ceremonial role.
I know, it's not quite the same thing, yes, I know.
So there's loads of change going on, right? We're seeing the death of our monarch, we've got King Charles now. What does all this change mean for Britain's place in the world and our identity? So loss of the Queen, we've got the crashing pound, we've got these Brexit-imposed trade barriers going up. In fact, we've got a graph, which we'll cut to now as well, our tanking economy and tanking exports. So this graph was doing the rounds on Twitter, and it's quite phenomenal to see what's happened to the UK in terms of our exporting and how we have quite quickly dropped down in terms of how we perform versus other countries in the world. So looking at that, it doesn't feel like the only way is up, does it, panel? Any thoughts, Hardeep?
No, it doesn't, does it?
And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us as Brits? How we feel about ourselves, our place in the world, our identity? What does all of this mean for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because a lot of people voted for Brexit. It'll be interesting to see what those people think of it, think of how it's panning out now, you know, in terms of how that has interacted with the effects of the pandemic, the climate emergency, the war in Ukraine, but also, as you say, what it's done for our hard and soft power, you know, that how we think of ourselves in the world and the influence that we have. I think it's really interesting that Liz Truss, during the Conservative leadership campaign, didn't want to say whether the French president was a friend or foe. And this week, I think yesterday, he said that we'll always work to be friends and allies in a complex world. And I really liked that he said that, because we are in a complex world, and simplistic ideas, whether that comes to the economy, whether that comes to geopolitics, whether that comes to how we relate to our friends in Europe, the US, I think that is part of the problem. You know, the world is getting ever more complicated. It's increasingly going to become that way. The climate emergency is going to cause all sorts of massive shifts across the world. We talk about people, we talk about borders, etc. And I think my concern is that here we're in a very binary way of thinking in terms of Britain. But we always have this notion that we were, you know, you rule Britannia. And I think that's coming back to the conversation we've just had about the monarchy. That's where I think it's interesting that notion, that mythology, somehow still has some weight in the present, because we transition that into global Britain. And global Britain, it's a myth. The US have said, you know, we're not going to get a trade deal in the short or medium term. The Prime Minister said that. They're not queuing up to do that for us. Why would they? And then in Europe, I'm sure people look at us and really respected the Queen, but probably think, what on earth is going on in this country? So we need to look at where those myths come from and how they're holding us back in a practical sense.
If we get another government, say Labour or Labour and Liberal Democrat, Green, it needs to make an immediate assessment of what our strengths really are. What are our strengths? We know our weaknesses. You know, this government has led us into a terrible situation. The pound crashing to the extent to which it has, falling so Bahar and other countries, is very much to do with the Brexit campaign, but not just about Brexit itself, but how Brexit was done. At the time, a lot of people were saying, a lot of the Brexiters were saying, oh, well, we'll stay in the single market, we'll stay in the customs union. Because it was the hardest of all possible and most aggressive of Brexits, it can be repaired. Doesn't mean you have to have another referendum, God help us. A sensible government assessing what we really need to do can rebuild our relationships with Europe. We can get on very well with them. We can have all kinds of, you know, like the Horizon programmes and things that we've been cut out of, which are really important, as you know, particularly in the science world. We can look at our soft power. The BBC is invaluable. We should expand it, not contract it. The idea of axing the licence fee, cutting it yet again, it's been cut and cut and cut again ever since the Tories took over. They just hate it. They hate the very fact that it's not a private enterprise. We need to assess all of those things, our arts, our sport, all of the things that really project us into the world, and invest in those. I mean, that might include the city as well, which is part of, you know, what makes us a global, if you like. We've got to think about these things which are really important, instead of prancing around and posturing with ideological absurdities of one kind or another, believing the market can always fix everything. The NHS is something else we're proud of.
Why do you think they're happy to perpetuate that? For example, this prancing around, this warmongering almost with the EU, being very happy to provoke a trade war. Why are they doing that?
It's a deep ideological position where they really detest Europe and everything the European Union stands for. And they want us to stand out on our own, gallant little Britain on its own, sinking on its own. They believe it. And if they don't believe it, they fear enough people in their party believe it that if you want to get on as a Conservative, you need to believe it or pretend to. Who knows what Truss really believes. And that's why we need to get rid of the Conservatives now, so they can go away, rethink, reform, put themselves back into some kind of coherent conservatism, not this wild Brexit party, UKIP-ery that they've
ERG.
become. They need to start again.
I think one of the things that's really interesting that we don't discuss enough either, in my opinion, is what does love of one's country amount to? So patriotism is often something that, is weaponised, I would say, by those on the right, some people who support Brexit. But is love of one's country a willingness to see it getting poorer, getting more unequal, its exports going down, the pound crashing? Is that loving Britain?
It's lost its meaning. Patriotism has now become...
If you go to Scotland, is seeing the health service collapse and the education system fall into bits nationalism, because that's what's happening under the SNP. But I think there is an important point, that this whole global Britain idea is, in my view, it's a good idea, but looking for substance. And it's been floating around, I think it was 2017, 2018, the government first came up with the idea. And I think it is vital that we do now think about our place in the world. I think we've got to accept that Brexit has happened. I don't see any way of the country rowing back. And, that may be a disappointment for a lot of people, but I think we just need to accept that fact. And so we do need to understand and decide where our relationships are, how we're going to deal with the Commonwealth, because we do have some countries who are now saying that they want to reconsider their position, certainly with the King as head of state, but possibly within the Commonwealth as well. We need to understand where we're going to position ourselves in terms of hard power. Clearly that's been quite successful in Ukraine, but soft power as well. I mean, actually, I agree with Polly about the BBC. It's a fantastic resource. The BBC and the British Council, I think, are two of the greatest soft power resources we have, and we need to make more of that. But I'd also argue, actually, that what we saw on Monday was a fantastic demonstration of British soft power, because you had leaders from all over the world coming here to pay tribute to the Queen's 70-year reign. I think that is an important part of brand Britain. But it is something we need to think about, and it will include hard conversations and hard outcomes.
Are you optimistic about brand Britain under Truss?
I'm sceptical. I've been sceptical for a long time. I think there are ideas out there which, if they were all pulled together, could start to look something like an integrated foreign policy. But I don't think we're there yet.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of her approach, for example, to tackling the cost of living crisis and the energy price cap?
Well, I mean, the price cap, I think, was an inevitability, and I think it's a shame that it took quite as long as it did. Mm-hmm. We still don't know how we're going to pay for it. It's going to be an awful lot of money, but I think it was something that had to happen. But I think we also need to separate out a little bit the cost of living crisis from longer-term energy issues, some of which have come up as a result of the war in Ukraine, some of which are more systemic. But like everything else that faces government, it's complicated, and that's difficult sometimes.
But Elliot, this notion of global Britain, do you agree with Polly that it's ideologically driven? Is it a mythic notion of going back to something when Britain was great and had its empire? Where do you think that notion of it really is coming from?
I tend to think ideology is what people call your ideas if they don't like them, so I don't think that's a particularly useful way of looking at it. Clearly, there is a lot of rhetoric around global Britain, which is retrospective, which is looking at a Britain that frankly never existed, the kind of buccaneering, Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, all that kind of stuff, which I don't think is particularly helpful. But I think it is useful to remember, and we have a very British way of self-deprecation in this country, which is fantastic, but we can occasionally overlook some of our strengths as a country. Saying that we've fallen behind India to be only the sixth largest economy in the world. Actually, the sixth largest economy in the world isn't terrible for a country of our size. And we have things like the BBC, like the common law, which we've distributed around the world, which is the fundamental basis of a lot of the economic systems that are now in place. So there are things which are great about Britain and its constituent parts, and that's another issue. But
I might let you have the closing point before we need to wrap up the show. I can see you itching.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what's been said just now about the need to invest in British culture, our arts, our music, our science. The recent pageantry was also part of that British identity and traditions being poured out there. And this is one of the reasons why I go absolutely berserk when I see what people often refer to as flag shagging, which is not investing in our arts, in our culture, in all the parts of society that need nourishment, but rather just putting up the British flag. Everyone around the world has a flag, and it's been so incredibly superficial when at the same time this government has been attacking lots of our arts institutions that have been asking for different types of help. So I think that on that level, we should be investing a lot more in a lot of that soulful stuff that comes from our country. It's good for us, it's good for the world, it's good for humanity. On the economic front, I disagree with your notion about not going back to the EU. I think that the notions that we have of, us versus them, master-slave relationships or whatever, Britain was actually starting to really make its way in the world as a team player and as a team leader. And that was a real opportunity sat there in the EU. Now, Brexit has pressed a reset button, but we can't spend the rest of human history Britain pressing that reset button over and over again. No, we will not get closer. No, we will not work with them. No, no, no. We have to rebuild. Now, whether that's going fully back into the EU or the single market or setting up a new pillar within the single market, that's the conversation that needs to be had, not just for pragmatic matters, but for the soul of Britain. We can be good diplomats, we can be good team players, we can be leaders on that level. And if we can't get on with our neighbours, well, then we're just falling at the first hurdle. So that's the thing that we should be getting on with. Investing in our country, in the soul of our country, putting it out there and getting to work again with our neighbours and refinding our place in Europe as that first stepping stone to actually being a sensible, responsible country again.
I agree, Mike. I think we can do all of those things, but I don't think we can do them under this Tory party, under this government. So with that, I think we'll close. I think there's so much more to discuss. I know I got the last word. It's great. That's all we have time for tonight. What did you think? Did anyone change your mind? Did anyone leave you outraged? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next week at the table. Good night.